think if I were to sum up, our theme for the day was obviously faithful presence, but what I'm hearing the Spirit remind us of is some of the qualities for faithful presence, the cost of faithful presence, the suffering that comes with faithful presence, and the perseverance that is required for faithful presence. But in all that, in the next 9 minutes that I have, I want to remind you of the hope, not the eternal hope, but the hope, the longing that we have that God would do something special in this nation. And I want to do it by comparing two nations 200 years ago and what happened. They were both at a very similar point to this nation now. I want to compare the nations of England and France. The time is the early 1700s. It's the moment of the birth of the Enlightenment. Reason has become the enlivening force which has led to the scientific revolution and the industrial revolution. A few people are getting very wealthy whilst the masses remain in poverty. The church in Britain and in France is really in a similar state. Britain, it is spiritually anemic, liberal, and lacking in conviction. In France, it is corrupt and synonymous with the monarchy. And yet in those two nations, over the next 2 generations, they take a very different trajectory. In one, the church is destroyed, a new national god is adopted, the poor are ignored, and mass executions ensue. In the other, there is religious revival, a care for the poor, and stability created, which leads to ongoing strengthening and prosperity in future generations. Let me tell you in just a few minutes, or pick out some of the key points of the story of those two nations over that period of time. In France, the new men of the age were the philosophers. For them, the church was part of the old order. It was to be rolled away. Voltaire would often sign his letters speaking of the church, "Crush the loathsome thing." Diderot famously spoke of his desire to strangle the last king with the entrails of the last priest. It was a dangerous thing to do my job in pre-revolutionary France. But without a strong response from the church, which is needed when the church is intimidated, then the nation gave their heart to the reason of the philosophers. Calvin had reminded people 100 years before that our hearts are what he called idol factories. That if we do not worship God, then we will give ourselves to something else, often a good thing, but that becomes an ultimate thing. And the church in France turned away from worship and gave itself to reason as a result. Reason became the nation's ultimate tool of redemption. The philosophers became the new high priests. They even had a book. They called it the Encyclopedia. And their goal was to collect all knowledge, saying that men would be more virtuous and more happy as a result. Of course, the only problem when you only focus on logic is that whilst it's efficient and in some ways effective, there is no place for compassion and there's no place for mercy. So Voltaire was told that the poor were not to be bothered with. Don't bother educating them. They're too idiotic, bestial, too miserable to ever change. And that desire for rebirth found its fullest expression in the French Revolution. Sharp French analyst de Tocqueville said, the ideal of the French Revolution was nothing short of a regeneration of the whole human race. Time was to be redeemed. No longer was time to be measured from the incarnation. Now it was to be measured from the day of the abolition of the monarchy. Day 1 of the first month was the next day. The great churches of France were also to be redeemed. They were turned into temples of reason with the word philosophy written over their gateposts. In Notre Dame, they celebrated the Feast of Reason. There was an altar dedicated to reason, upon which stood the torch of truth, and the congregation paid homage to a woman dressed provocatively as the goddess of liberty. What was the result of all of this? A nation that gave its heart to the wrong thing. It was that ultimately it unleashed self-destructive forces. So the revolution led to thousands of innocent people dying at the hands of the guillotine. And then the very people who found themselves perpetuating the cleansing found themselves too beheaded before too long. Something very different happened in this nation. Here it was not the philosophers who grew to eminence. Actually, the celebrity of this city at the age of 25 was a young preacher. His name was George Whitefield. Thousands of people would come and listen to him speak. The greatest actor of the age, David Garrick, said, "I will pay somebody £100 if they can teach me to say, 'oh,' like George Whitefield would say, 'oh.'" And by the time that George Whitefield's name was a celebrity, just 2 miles from where we're sitting this afternoon, a young man went to a prayer meeting, he said reluctantly, if you've ever had that experience. But it said that as he went, he found his heart strangely warmed. And John Wesley adopted Whitefield's approach and went into the fields to preach. He went to the Kingswood miners, known for their violence as well as their poverty. And as he preached to them, he said he knew he was getting through because though their faces were covered with soot just out of the mines, he could see rivets of tears just falling down their faces. Over the next 40 years, those two and many others preached sometimes 5 times a day. Thousands of people came to faith. And whilst Whitefield would just go and find the next lot and was always crossing the Atlantic, Wesley gathered them into small groups. And he taught them. He taught them how to turn up on time. He taught them how to work hard. He taught them to be good neighbors, to manage their money, and that the foundation of it all was following Jesus Christ. At the end of his life, at the end of their lives, Whitefield had no followers at all. He said, "It feels like my ministry has been a rope of sand." John Wesley had 70,000 followers. They became Methodists. You know how many Methodists there are in the world today? There are 70 million. It was the Methodists, the early ones, those first 70,000, who reformed the prisons. I wish I got time to tell you that story. They lifted thousands out of poverty. They started the trade union movement, giving workers a voice. They campaigned against the slave trade, and they started the Sunday schools that led to education for everybody. Methodist youth clubs even developed to the point where they started Everton and Aston Villa football clubs. The Prime Minister, David Lloyd George, of later said that this revolution affected the whole country, but he said it was a civilizing revolution. The English historian J.R. Green said that Methodism changed the whole tone of English society. And it was a French historian who said that it was John Wesley and his ministry that saved this country from revolution. Let me just give you a few thoughts as I come into land. First of all, it is true that the role of the church really matters. The Bible does not suggest that we are to be dominant, but it does suggest that we're to be influential. That's what salt and that's what light do. When we are not, our economics, our politics, and our social policy become inhumane. Our inclination is to blame the leaders involved, but maybe if the church was a little more vital, maybe if the church was a little more faithful presence, then those institutions wouldn't go that way anyway. Secondly, we cannot put our hope in political, social, or cultural revolutions. Why? Because the biggest problem is the human heart. It was George Orwell who said that the amputation of the soul is not a simple surgical job. The wound has a tendency to go septic. And that is what the French at that point failed to see. And that is why we all need Jesus. We cannot put our hope in man. It's a very short stop from worshipping reason to worshipping man himself. Man, the measure of all things. Napoleon, who followed from the French Revolution, may have cancelled the revolution, but he still believed that man could be the saviour. So as all the other great men of France looked on, it was Napoleon who crowned himself as emperor, for there was no one greater who could do so. And yet within 15 years, his armies had been totally defeated. And the French Constitution, with no checks and no balances to account for the fallenness of man, had to be rewritten 5 times in the next 150 years. Spiritual renewal and revival should lead to cultural, social, and political renewal. And that is why we devote the last part of our day to just that, to seeking God for the thing that we cannot do, to looking to God for what only he can do. It is our conviction that the greatest hope the poor can have is an outpouring of the Spirit. That the greatest hope for all men and women, you, me, our families, our neighbours, and the people of this city, is an outpouring of the Spirit. We believe it is the greatest hope for our nation. Let's welcome Joshua as he comes to speak again.